As I mentioned at the start of the show, we have a guest joining us. She'll be on phone today. She's been on the show before. Her name is Reggie Littlejohn, and she's just an amazingly accomplished woman. I'll tell you just a little bit about her, and then we'll bring her on. She is the founder of an organization called Women's Rights Without Frontiers. She works and has worked in China for years, fighting the one-child policy, helping women who've gone through forced abortions or protecting them when they are threatened with forced abortion, helping women in China, senior citizens who are also ignored by China's government or they're are just squeezed out by China's culture and society. She's been active on the ground, founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers. She's actually a Yale Law School graduate, and so I'm sure could be a prominent lawyer in some major law firm, but instead she's dedicated her life to helping children and women in China. Last thing about her, she has been she's an acclaimed international expert on China's one-child policy. She's testified 6 times in the U.S. Congress, 3 times at the European Parliament. She's presented at the British, Irish, and Canadian parliaments as well. She's just been a real figure in international and in the world's conversation about China's one-child policy. So here we have Reggie Littlejohn joining us. Hi, Reggie. Whoops, do we have her? Okay, we had her a minute ago. I talked to her before we went out. Well, what matters is getting her back on the phone.
Oh, hi, Debbie. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for having me. That was a very generous introduction.
You're so welcome, and I'm glad that you're there. I'm so happy to get to talk to you. So I want to give you a chance before we get into all the details about China. Just if you would, please tell our listeners again, as you have other times on the show, about your organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. What's it all about? When did you start it? And what is your work in China?
Well, I started the organization a long time ago. And as an attorney, I had represented Chinese refugees in their cases for political asylum. One of my refugees that I represented was a woman who had been persecuted as a Christian and forcibly sterilized. And that's how I found out, this was in the mid-90s, that China, I had understood that China had a one-child policy, but I'd never stopped to think how it was enforced. And I learned it was enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide. So I left the practice of law and founded the organization Women's Rights Without Frontiers to end forced abortion in China. So China has now moved from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. But what the listeners need to understand is that even under the two-child policy, forced abortion remains, because the new rule is that every couple is allowed to have 2 children, which means that you have to be part of a couple to have a child, which means that single women are still forcibly aborted. And also third children are forcibly aborted. So we continue to press the government to end all coercive population control. And we also are the only organization in the world that has a network on the ground inside of China that is actively saving baby girls from sex-selective abortion and abandonment, and also abandoned widows in the countryside.
Okay, what's the cultural thing that happens where you end up with abandoned widows in the countryside? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the one-child policy completely decimated the Chinese family structure. In the past, the Chinese people, their culture was loving kids, having big families, especially in the countryside, in the farming communities. And so when an elderly couple became old and really couldn't help themselves, they had a large extended family to help them. And now under the one-child policy, they do not have any family to help them. And so senior suicide in China has skyrocketed 500% in the last 20 years in conjunction with the one-child policy. China is the only country in the world where more women than men kill themselves. And in the Chinese countryside, 3 times the number of women as men kill themselves. So our network, which has been saving baby girls for years, I became aware of these abandoned widows in the countryside. And we just go to them and we say, we understand that you need help, and we're here to help you. And these women are intensely grateful, because no one in Chinese Communist society just helps somebody because they need help. And so what we do is we go to their door and we visit them every month, and we bring with us a stipend. It's $25 in yuan. which is the Chinese currency, to help them eat every day, to help them maybe heat their little room in the winter, and just to be someone who cares about them. And these women, they say to us, my own family doesn't care about me, and yet people from the other side of the world are showing me that I'm loved, and that I'm a human being created in the image of God, which is also something that the Chinese government does not tell people.
That is just staggering. Comparing that, what you just described about widows and what happens in America. I'm picturing widows, especially senior citizen widows. America is filled with nursing homes, retirement homes, senior communities. There's nothing like that in China?
Well, there may or may not be in China, but I'm talking about the rural countryside where people don't have money to put somebody in a place like that. Senior homes are expensive, and so the government certainly doesn't provide them. So the thing about it, Debbie, is that because of the one-child policy, China's senior population is quickly eclipsing its working population. To where in the point of in the year 2050, it's some very large proportion of their population, something like 25% of their population will be over the age of 60. So they just can't afford to give all of these people a place in a nice senior home where all their needs are being taken care of. And so just like we have forced abortion, and also the selective abortion of baby girls at the beginning of life, I'm really worried about these seniors at the end of life. And what's happening is they're basically killing themselves. And that's becoming, something that's alarming about that is that it's becoming accepted and even encouraged. Like we have one widow, when her husband got sick, so her husband was still alive, her husband got sick, and their daughter-in-law went around telling the neighbors and came and yelled at them saying, why don't you just let him die? And she pointed to the example of a woman in their community who, when she discovered she had breast cancer, she went and hanged herself on the tree in the backyard, and to save her family the financial burden of trying to help her with treatment. And that was considered to be a positive example of what people should do. And so we disagree with that.
Yeah, I
and
hope
we
so.
go to these people and we say, you are valuable. You're a human being created in the image of God, and we're going to be here for you from now until the time that you leave this earth. And that's what we do for the widows in our area of rural China.
That is an astonishing story. Just even the one story of a woman deciding the best choice when she got a bad diagnosis was to hang herself in the backyard, and that it was touted by another adult woman as this is what you're supposed. That's just astonishing. Use the word gender side, and I want to have you talk about that a little bit, about that, just what the term means. And I think you talked about it both in China as well as in India, and actually it's in your primarily featured in your film. It's a girl. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So gendercide is the killing of girls, baby girls, and in China and India. And in other areas, not just China and India, but in other areas as well, there is a preference for boys. And under the one-child policy, now the two-child policy, second daughters in China are especially vulnerable because people will, if they have one girl, they will say, okay, well, we can have two kids, so the second one will be a boy. That's how they comfort themselves about the girl for their first child. And then some couples will just keep aborting until they get that boy for the second child. For example, a couple of years ago, and this is after the institution of the two-child policy, there was an incident that came out of China where a woman's husband forced her to abort 4 baby girls within a year, and then she died. So what we do in our area is we lift up girls. And our network, we've been there long enough and we've gotten to know people well enough and people trust us enough that they will tell us if there is a woman in the community where her husband or her mother-in-law she's already, lots of times the situation is she already has a daughter. This is their second child. So the grandparents, the husband, are really looking at this second child as being, this is our last chance to have a boy. And then they pressure her to go in for an ultrasound. These women typically drag their feet because they know that if it's a girl, they're going to be forced to abort her, and they don't want to. so a lot of these ultrasounds happen when the woman is 7 months, 8 months, 9 months pregnant.
Oh, my God.
So all of these abortions of baby girls are, by definition, late term. And when we find out that this is happening to a woman, we will go to her door. So this is our network on the ground inside of China, which is extraordinary that we have a network that's inside of China of Chinese nationals, people who are local to the community. Go to her door and say, we understand that you're pregnant with a girl, or we understand that you've just given birth to a girl. Congratulations on your daughter. Girls are as good as boys, and we will give you a monthly stipend for a year to empower you to keep your daughter. And so, first of all, in the Chinese countryside, the idea that girls are as good as boys is revolutionary. They've never heard that before, okay? For I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of years they've had son preference there. And then secondly, the money, which is $25 a month in the local currency, enables them to go to their husband and their in-laws and say, look, I can't abandon this baby because she's a girl. She's a lucky girl. Look, she's already bringing money into the family. And we've empowered hundreds of women to keep their daughters with this very simple program. So that's what we do.
I'm amazed, actually. That is it's just a very straightforward belief that girls have value and virtue and worth also. I meant to mention before we started, we are speaking with Reggie Littlejohn. You can find her organization. It's Women's Rights Without Frontiers.org. And this is actually up at our website, too, americacanwetalk.org. But it's Women's Rights Without Frontiers.org. You can find her on Twitter at Reggie Little JHN. At Reggie Little JHN. And her work in China is just extraordinary. And I want to ask one more thing about that, and then turn to something else, to modern or issue of the day about coronavirus. But doesn't the fact, it has to be the case, that if more Chinese parents are aborting girls and going ahead and giving delivery to boys, they've got to end up with some kind of imbalance of an extreme nature among adults to find partners, to find marriages, because there'd be so many more men than women, or hasn't it worked out that way?
Oh, it's definitely worked out that way. I mean, there's an estimate between 30 and 40 million more men than women in China. And what that's doing is it's driving human trafficking and sexual slavery. So China is just a magnet for women from all of the countries surrounding it, and then as far away as Africa and South America, to bring women in as forced brides and sex slaves to service these 37 million frustrated bachelors. Wow.
As yet another horrific consequence of this one-child policy. And, as a transition to the coronavirus discussion that got started in the current problem that got started in Wuhan, in America, there are, of course, people who advocate for the right to an abortion and others who advocate for right to life. And so you have those groups very outspoken, trying to influence policy in Washington, and you have a reflection from the medical community and from the government in general that they understand their role is to try, generally speaking, to serve the needs of the people. The government's trying to do that. The medical community, the doctors and hospitals and the whole medical care system designed to try to help the needs of the people. But a lot of it in America is rooted in that notion you mentioned a moment ago about the idea that we see all people as made in God's image, as having not everyone sees that, but many Americans do, made in God's image, a God-given right to live, to life and liberty, a God-given purpose in life. But China is obviously communist, religion is frowned upon, and the notion of respect for the value of human life just because you're born obviously doesn't exist in the way it does here, given how the one-child policy was a government policy. It's a long lead-in to say, I don't know what, based on your work over there, you come to understand about how the coronavirus situation got started, how the people who are suffering from coronavirus in China are treated. Like, and I don't know, Reggie, I don't know if you have this kind of information about China. We're trying to get at how it feels in China with the coronavirus. Does it feel like the government cares or they don't? Are there advocates out there trying to speak up that the government's got to help these people? What's the situation on the ground in your understanding?
Well, I mean, okay, so there's two answers to that question. There's my where I am and the experience of my steel workers. Okay, and then there's the things I've seen on YouTube, on Twitter, unbelievable footage of the way that they've been cracking down. So anyway, in terms of my personal, my network in China, the coronavirus has not hit our area very hard. I can't say where our near area is. It's like the biggest secret because we don't want the government coming in and shutting us down. So last time I spoke with my my field director, there were only 3 cases. The 3 people had all gone to the hospital and then recovered and been released. Nevertheless, last time I asked them, they were on lockdown, meaning that the villages are closed and that people could only leave their home with what she described as being like a passport. So let's say there's a family of 3 living somewhere. One person can leave every 3 days to get food, and they have the passport. And when they come back, maybe somebody else 3 days later can leave. So that's the experience in my area. Now, I have seen on Twitter unbelievable videos of areas, I think, where maybe it's been hit harder. It's not uniform all over China. I mean, there's areas that have been hit really hard, and there's areas that have almost been unaffected, like my area. But, I mean, I saw footage of people literally being dragged out of their homes, screaming and crying by people in hazmat suits, and then thrown into what looks like a box on the back of a truck, screaming like this woman was screaming like she was being murdered. And the reason being that China's the word I've been getting out or seeing through these Twitter feeds is that China's main goal is containment, not cure.
Yes.
So they'll take anybody that they think might have the virus, whether they have it or not, certainly somebody who does have the virus, and throw them into what they will call a hospital. But the hospital is really just a containment center with very little medical treatment. The people are put in beds right next to each other so they can infect each other. And it's basically like a death sentence. And so that's how they have been containing or attempting to contain the virus in certain areas. There's no human rights involved there, and really not a way to help the people who have the virus, just separate them out so it doesn't spread.
Boy, one thing I meant to mention in my first 5, and I'll just share because it's relevant to what you were just saying, but in America, the determination of the medical community, the healthcare community, to try to help, to figure out how can we do our part. I mean, President Trump is, cutting off travel to China, now cutting off travel to Europe. He is, he's having CDC get all the instructions they can out to people. They're now dispersing test kits throughout America so that they're more available. There was I think it's a Cleveland Clinic. It was a hospital, I'm pretty sure, called Cleveland Clinic, that announced today that they had come up with a test for coronavirus that will allow you to get the results within 8 hours. And currently, the test being distributed by CDC, when you take, I assume it's a blood sample, whatever sample they take, you get your answer back whether you are testing positive for coronavirus within 2 to 7 days. And this Cleveland Clinic said, no, same day, 8 hours. And that just speaks to the heart and the mindset of America and the medical community here. We're all in this fight together against coronavirus. I mean, the difference between a company working as hard, a hospital, a research hospital working as hard as they can to come up with a coronavirus vaccine, that's happening, and a coronavirus testing kit to get an answer, versus the medical community there settling for round people up, drag them off the streets, and at least get them away from other people. There's just something very different about the culture of love and care for your fellow citizens between America and China. You agree?
Oh, well, yeah. There's just a whole different way that we were founded. We were founded by people of faith, and our culture is that we are human beings created in the image of God with unalienable rights, and these rights come from God, and they cannot be abrogated by the government. Whereas in China, the Chinese Communist Party was never elected. They took over in 1945 and have been ruling with an iron fist ever since then. They are officially atheistic, which means they do not believe in God. They heavily persecute religious believers of all faiths, including Protestants and Catholics. And their basic idea is the government determines what rights you have, okay? There's no such thing as God. The government determines whether you have a right or not. So it's a diametrically opposite worldview, and our societies reflect the worldviews from which they came.
I just could not agree more, and I think that's such an important point for people to recognize about America. I know there's always a determination by political parties, political opponents to criticize the other one and call them up for anything they should have done differently or could have done differently. But really, the determination, I mentioned at Cleveland Clinic, trying to come up with a faster test, and then you have the CDC trying to distribute tests as fast as they distributing tests to figure out if you have the problem, if you have the virus, and then other entities all over America and in Israel working on a vaccine round the clock. I mean, there's just the difference in the mentality and the culture of a culture that values life and the right of the individual to live in freedom from a culture like China. It's actually a great time for America. It's a great window on China for Americans willing to pay attention and learn to see how different life is in China. So I'll close out. First of all, I love what you're doing, Reggie Littlejohn. I love it. I want to tell our listeners again, if they can go to your website. It is just an extraordinary organization, womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. So what's next on your agenda in China? What are you up to this coming year in China?
Well, let me tell you, I'm pretty upset because this week is the week that every year I go. We had two beautiful events that we were going to be presenting at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, and the whole thing was canceled. 70,000 women from all over the world were going to, converge on New York City, and this is what we do every year. And our organization is really respected there, and we've always been able to put on events, and the whole thing was canceled because of the coronavirus, which I understand. I mean, I think it was a right decision, okay, because these women are from all over the world, and it's just, everybody's really in close proximity with everybody else, especially in elevators and everything. So anyway, so that's kind of a disappointment. But one of the things that we also are wanting to do is to expand into India, and we are developing a partnership that we're going to be able to start expanding to saving girls and widows in India. So, and we've also, I mean, we haven't really publicly announced this yet, but we've started to save widows in Uganda as well. So we're women's rights without frontiers, so we don't have to stay just in China. We can go anywhere and help women.
Reggie Littlejohn, I just commend you so much. Thank you so much for taking time to join me today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and let's talk again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Take care, Reggie. Okay, folks, I want you to go to her website. You will love it. You will just realize this woman is on fire. I happen to know her personally. We met years ago at a conference and have talked again recently at a conference. She's just on fire to save people, especially in China. When you realize, I want to take a little bit of time to really have us be thinking through the difference between how life is viewed, how government views life when you're the Chinese Communist government and when you're America.